How many of you have heard the story that Warren Mosler talks about the business cards? He would tax his children in the form of his business cards. And if they don't provide the business cards, he will take away play dates, TV time, etc. And the reason why he did this is because they weren't doing their chores. And he wanted to have them to clean their room, do the dishes, all of that. And so he imposed the tax in his business cards. And then they asked, well, how do we get the business cards? And he said, well, if you clean your room, I'll give you 5 business cards. And the whole thing basically generated a little monetary system in the household. And I thought that was so cute. Such a cute little experiment. And he says, the government works this way. The tax creates unemployment and people have to work to get the money. That there is, in a sense, an original sin in the monetary system, that taxation is that one initial cause of unemployment.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. A big thank you to all of our supporters so far. At the beginning there, you heard economist and author of The Case for a Job Guarantee, Professor Pavlina Tcherneva. And in a moment, we'll hear highlights of her presentation at this year's Levy Economics Institute Summer Seminar. Our huge thanks to the Levy Institute for their kind permission to produce the audio, and I've linked to where you can see video of the whole presentation in our show notes. If you're new to MMT, you can listen to our first 3 episodes for an introduction, but if you want to dive in here, as you heard at the beginning, money is designed to create unemployment, not out of malice, but so that the issuer of currency, the national government, can step in and solve the problem it created by hiring people. Taxation creates a demand for the government's currency, which allows it to spend its money into existence to pay for things, whether it's roads and bridges and public transport and hospitals and schools and doctors and nurses in advanced economies, or a prime minister's gold wallpaper in emerging market economies. Unfortunately, since mainstream economics adopted the view that stagflation was the result of workers getting too uppity, unemployment's become a policy target rather than a policy failure. But the good news is that there is actually a better way to manage an economy than getting 9 six-figure salaried people together every few weeks to see how they feel about forcing millions of people into involuntary unemployment in the name of price stability. Because guess what? They're always okay with it. I mean, these meetings could have just been one email. Professor Tcherneva will lay out that sane alternative in a moment, but as I see it, either there is a trade-off between inflation and unemployment, in which case we should implement a job guarantee, or there isn't a trade-off between inflation and unemployment, in which case we should implement a job guarantee. Just before we dive in, right now in the UK as I record this, there's still a lot of what Conservative MPs are probably going to start calling alternative stability in the gilt market, and I think the dynamics we covered in last week's episode with Dr. Dirk Entz are still at play, so check that out if you haven't already. Basically, private pension funds holding risky assets were hurriedly selling off UK government bonds or gilts to get the money to meet their liabilities, and the sell-off was pushing gilt prices down, and so the Bank of England intervened by buying gilts to push the prices back up to what they considered to be quote-unquote orderly. But then also this week, additionally, the BOE have been offering financial support directly to private pension funds, presumably to stop these disorderly gilt sell-offs, while at the same time, the Governor of the Bank of England has told pension fund managers they've got until Friday to stop needing the support. But then also the Financial Times is reporting that the Bank of England has said privately that the support may continue beyond Friday. Now, I'm not saying it was and always has been a bad idea to make the provisioning of retirees dependent on the emotions of traders, but I guess my point is that free markets do seem to need a fair bit of government intervention. And given that that intervention starts with the creation of money itself, my sincere hope is that one day we recognise money for what it is, which is a policy tool for provisioning the public purpose, rather than a finite quantity of consumption tokens we all have to fight over and ultimately take to some global global casino to afford retirement. But for more on all of the above, in the show notes for this episode, I've linked to our job guarantee episodes and our monetary operations episodes, just in case any of the not the real Nobel Prize Committee are listening, because they seem a bit confused about how banks work. And as ever, I've linked to where you can support this podcast financially via patreon.com/MMT podcast. Support starts at $1 a month or £1 a month or whatever the equivalent is wherever you live. And no matter what level of support you give, you get early access to all of our episodes and patron-only episodes. Your financial support really helps keep the show going, and your support in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just by listening and spreading the word about this stuff, really helps too. So thanks, as ever, for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive in.
My name is Pavlina Tcherneva. I have a very simple task today, and that is to explain why the job guarantee is not an afterthought or secondary to the MMT project, but why it is core and how it really comes out of our particular understanding of the monetary system. So I really enjoyed the discussion yesterday with Chris Desan, and she made a comment that the revival of the money project hasn't been connected to the revival of labor, right? The connection of labor. And I thought that was so interesting because it is her work, in fact, and the work of other historians who really elucidate that link, that there is a very inherent connection between the nature of money, the origins of money, and the way labor is organized. And so hopefully I'll be able to make that case to you today, that whatever conversation we engaged in about the public money, about democratizing money, that actually goes hand in hand with democratizing the terms on which labor is offered. So the job guarantee is a straightforward proposal to provide permanent, federally funded, locally administered with via distributed system program, which would provide voluntary employment opportunity at living wage and benefits on demand to anyone who's seeking such work. So the case that I want to make here is that from an MMT perspective, this is not just another jobs program. It's actually a structural reform, structural macroeconomic policy to unemployment, whatever the cause is. So we'll be reviewing how the job guarantee represents a safety net, its anti-cyclical features, how it is a self-limiting program. It's very much an alternative to the way conventional policy is exercised, fine-tuning, and how it represents an economy-wide benchmark for labor standards. I often start with actually the human rights angle because the job guarantee is not a new proposal. Calls to secure the right to employment date as far back as the late 1700s. And, there is a reason for this. The birth of the market economy, wage labor, the economic insecurity that came with this were palpable. They were understood. And so the right to guarantee employment was that initial call for economic security. But what I will focus on is that, yes, it does importantly provide a legally enforceable right to employment. But I want to just concentrate today on how the MMT-informed job guarantee proposal rests on two core MMT propositions. The first one is that taxation creates unemployment. And the second is that the currency issuer is a price setter. How many of you have heard the story that Warren Mosler talks about the business cards that he used in his household? Okay, about half of you. Very quickly, 1996, Warren Mosler was looking for a researcher, and I found out about it. I got the job, and he told me about this scenario in his household where he would tax his children in the form of his business cards. And if they don't provide the business cards, he will take away play dates, TV time, etc. And the reason why he did this is because they weren't doing their chores. And he wanted to have them to clean their room, do the dishes, all of that. And so he imposed a tax in his business cards. And then they asked, well, how do we get the business cards? And he said, well, if you clean your room, I'll give you 5 business cards. And the whole thing basically generated like a little monetary system in the household. And I thought that was so cute. Like such a cute little experiment. And he says, the government works this way. The tax creates unemployment and people have to work to get the money. And I just couldn't believe that it was like that simple. In terms of experience, how one experiences MMT, for me, that was like the first claim that sounded a bit like too easy until you start reading about the history of money. And when you start reading about the history of money, you understand that that's exactly what the function of the tax is. The tax is never to generate finance for the state, if you will. The taxation has been always there to drive real resources, always to bring some sort of resource, some sort of labor, some sort of commodity, livestock, grain, whatever, to the palace. Mesopotamian palaces, the earliest forms of money are clay tablets. I mean, they are written checks. They're little claims where they will represent the payment of wages or, how much livestock one is entitled to, etc. And so MMT looks to this history and argues that taxation is a neglected cause of unemployment, that the main purpose of taxation is to indeed distribute resources in the system, to drive them usually from the private to the public domain, and that taxes are paid by performing that labor. And so when you look to as I said, clay tablets or tally sticks, where the markings represent wage payments. When you look at these old plantations, right, the haciendas, which used labor but paid labor in the form of coins that were denominated in days of work, you realize that these claims, these financial claims, represent some sort of real resource, a number of days of work performed. And the tax is then paid by delivering that token back to the hacienda that represents how much work has been performed. Corvée labor, as old as ancient Greece, even the pyramids were likely built through corvée labor, which is forced labor, which is required labor and can be performed in lieu of payment of taxes. When you study the colonization of Africa, and that's actually how I stumbled upon this history, you realize that taxation is a very effective tool of colonial exploitation. And so taxes have always been a tool of resource transfer, and they create some kind of unemployment, so to speak. In the modern world, money obfuscates these relationships. Money is a veil, everything, all transactions take place in a currency. And so we actually don't see the true purpose behind some of these core economic relationships. So if you've studied economics, you know that unemployment as a monetary phenomenon is not a new concept either. Right? That Marx had that idea that, capitalist system that produced for profit, has certain laws of motion that organize labor in such a way that not all labor is employed, and there's the reserve army of labor, right? That's part of the Marxian analysis. If you study Keynes, you know that he also had a monetary theory of unemployment, and he talked about deficient effective demand, that the profitability from employment is not sufficient to justify the cost associated from offering employment, right? And so there's like an effective demand problem. You have monetary unemployment, and he has a whole other analysis of money and returns on the money. Well, so MMT fits within this tradition. Institutionalists, of course, talk about the enclosure movement, property rights, path dependencies. For them, also, unemployment is a monetary phenomenon. But MMT adds to these stories by adding that there is, in a sense, an original sin in the monetary system, that taxation is that one initial cause of unemployment, that we may have many causes on which we typically focus, but we don't focus on the fact that when there is a non-reciprocal mandatory obligation, somebody has to do something to fulfill that obligation, to earn that which will settle the obligation. And the inability to do that, to earn that which will settle the tax in the modern world is monetary unemployment. So that is really one of the two core propositions in the MMT approach that connects the birth of money to unemployment. Now, the second recognition in the MMT approach is that in the modern world, currency is typically a public monopoly, and the monopolist is a price setter. All monopolists set prices. This we learn in Econ 100, and yet we never really engage with the idea, what does it mean for a currency monopolist? We talk about goods, but we don't talk about the monopolists of money. So all prices are administered. This is very much within, the post-Keynesian heterodox tradition, but there is a key price setter in the economy that is also often neglected, right? We talk about administered prices, markup approach, you administer all of that, but we do have a very crucial price setter in the economy, and that would be the monopoly issuer. So then how do we think about the price setting powers? Well, in economics, you have these two prices that usually we talk about. The first price will be the own rate of money, how money exchanges for itself. It could be the own rate of corn, how much corn begets if you plant corn, right? The own rate of the commodity. So the own rate of money is the interest rate. And we know how to set the interest rate. It's a straightforward thing. Before 2008, we used to sell and buy short-term securities to set the interest rate. Now we just set it directly. So the monopolist of the currency sets the price of money directly. It's a price setting function that is quite obvious. But when you take that step further, you realize that the monopolists can also set other prices if they so choose. So the commodity rate of money would be the exchange between money and other commodities. So if you're the sole supplier of currency, you can certainly set the terms on which you will provide it, and you can set the prices that you would pay for commodities. We do that too. Governments also do that too. And so, a good question would be, what commodity prices should we be setting? And so in the MMT tradition, much like all other traditions in heterodox approach, labor is special. It's not like corn. It's not like setting the price of money. It's not like setting the price of wheat or soybeans, etc. It is special, and I'm not going to go for all the over all the reasons why. I think they're quite obvious, but only to say that price setting is quite ubiquitous. So when you today read about administered prices, should the government set that price or that price, you should recognize that's very much part and parcel of public policy. We use procurement on regular basis to figure out how much we're going to pay for a contract. We've used buffer stocks for a very, very long time. And we have recognized that that's a pretty robust way of setting a price. Bill Mitchell talks about, how he arrived at the job guarantee proposal by looking at the buffer stock for wheat, how government will buy and sell wheat on demand so that it can peg the price of wheat at the desired level. So when market demand falls, then the public sector will purchase the excess wheat. When the market demand increases, there are inflationary pressures on wheat. The public sector will release, no, it's not wheat, wool, right? Wool, right? Australia, wool. And so buffer stocks have been there for centuries, actually. And we use them on ongoing basis. Like I just mentioned, before 2008, we used the buffer stock to set interest rates, a buffer stock of short-term securities. Right? We would sell securities and buy securities to drain reserves as needed to peg the price of reserves at a particular level. When there are excess reserves, we will drain them. When there's shortage of reserves, we will add them. It's a buffer stock. The gold standard is a buffer stock. It sets the price of gold. Right? You buy and sell gold as needed to maintain the price of gold at a particular rate to the currency. You could look at it from the other way around, right? The price of the currency in terms of gold, but it's a buffer stock. We do that with various other commodities. And so it's not really an extraordinary leap to say, why are we offering more protections for these other commodities in terms of prices than perhaps the most essential commodity in the economy? Okay, so for effective price setting, though, what we need to recognize that we need both a price target and we need to have a full employment policy. You can't hit the target unless you are prepared to buy and sell the commodity on demand. So this is where this idea comes from that we can design macroeconomic policy where we recognize that labor, employment is the reliable casualty of any economic fluctuation. It is always sacrifice, right? Technological change, globalization, crises. We know that reliably people lose their jobs as a consequence of these economic conditions. So why not provide a kind of support that will maintain the minimum decent living condition for all people? And so initially we used to call this the employer of last resort. We changed. I'm happy to talk why I changed and don't talk about that anymore. But the job guarantee is that. And so from an MMT perspective, what I want to emphasize today is what Abel Lerner, I stole this from Abel Lerner, he called theorems of purest form. And that we just want to have some of the basic kind of objective relationships, and then we can add on to that. And the first one, just to summarize, there are compulsory taxes in this world, fines, fees. In the modern world, everything is for sale. You have to buy everything, right? And so everything's compulsory in some sense. But non-reciprocal, obligatory fines, fees, dues, etc., create the need to earn that which will settle those debts. Those debts are settled in state money. Typically, final means of payment is the state currency, and the state happens to be monopoly issuer of the currency. Now we have nuanced analysis on this. Some states abdicate this right. Some states' monetary sovereignty is eroded, undermined by various other conditions. But as a first approximation, the first theorem, pure theorem, is that the state is the monopoly issuer of currency, and that the tax that the state imposes creates demand for that currency, and the inability to earn it creates unemployment. Thus, the very powers that are used to determine the money of account, to ensure that the private sector uses that money of account, right? Taxes play that crucial role. Those very same powers are the same powers that create monetary unemployment. So the problem of unemployment is not separate from our understanding of money. In fact, we need to understand that inherent connection, which means that a monopoly issuer, as a monopoly issuer, only the state can choke off that demand for currency. And the refusal to do so is actually a refusal to resolve a problem that it has helped create through the monetary system. All right. So by virtue of being currency monopolist, the state also can set prices. And by employing and releasing labor at a base wage on demand, the state can secure full employment and price stability. There is no trade-off. I think that is probably the most crucial part of the MMT project. There is no trade-off. We are not the first ones to criticize the Naira. Okay, there have been plenty, written on how poor the Naira is as a concept. I'll talk about it in a moment. But I think perhaps I would venture to say that maybe heterodoxy has not been able to mount a successful critique on the Naira because we haven't offered a genuine alternative to the trade-off. And I think the job guarantee is it. So the natural rate of unemployment, I mean, if you're just reading the news, I don't know, my blood boils. I don't read the news anymore because the Fed right now is deliberating how much unemployment they should create. The Wall Street Journal just had an article yesterday. It's like, oh, you just have to put up with some unemployment because inflation. Like, this is a discipline. Our discipline is completely structured around this idea that some people have to be living in economic insecurity in the name of price stability. There's no other way to deal with this problem in the mainstream. And you would have probably understood how schizophrenic the view is from the mainstream. Just 2 years ago, Chairman Powell was talking about how the Naira relationship has broken down, if it ever existed, right? So the Naira relationship, right? Everybody knows what the Naira is. There's a trade-off between unemployment and inflation, but there is like a non-accelerating rate of unemployment that we cannot breach that barrier. Else inflation just shoots through the roof, right? Accelerates. The mainstream has been believing this for quite some time, but Jay Powell comes up and says, no, that relationship has broken down. And then in the same breath, he says, but we need this relationship. Like, we really need to know what is the right level of unemployment. And he says, we need to know whether it's too high, too low, right? There is something called too low unemployment or just right. And then Eisner, I just love this quote from him. He says, and if unemployment is natural, God has certainly treated his children differently in different times and places. There's nothing natural or necessary about all this misery or the damage to the economy. And so, yes, God has certainly treated his children different. He has hurt children differently because in the United States, we would typically talk about a natural rate of 5.5%. Like, the CBO, I think, has a calculation of the natural rate. We're constantly below it, right? We've been below it before. But for Spain, Naira estimates have gone up to 26%. Like, what does that mean for the economy to be naturally unemployed at 26%, right? So there's something fundamentally broken in this approach. And then the return of the Naira, we see it today in the papers. The Fed is operating on a reserve army of labor policy. It's like a kind of the Marxist approach to taming inflation. You just keep people unemployed, and only working people are called upon to serve as sacrificial offerings in the fight against inflation. This was this has been recognized, and it was kind of the signature call for Greta Scott King, who was saying, why are we constantly insisting that people have to lose their livelihoods to fight inflation? In the 70s, it's the same story today. Okay, unemployment is a public sector failure. So if we have a state-administered monetary system, which creates unemployment, clearly it is also a public failure, but unemployment is also a problem that brings enormous social and economic costs. And I typically spend a lot more time talking about these. Go in the literature, it's very clear, mortality, health, physical, mental health effects that transfer not just to the person who experienced unemployment, children, partners. We don't account for these costs. Why don't macroeconomists try to bring these into their models, even when we try to figure out their efficiency outcomes? But what is even more kind of paradoxical is that the state chooses to pay these costs. So it has a critical role in the creation of unemployment, but then refuses to solve it, but then accepts that it has to pay the social costs of unemployment. As Bill Mitchell often says, the unemployed are already in the public sector, right? They're already there. Isn't there a better way to do this? And so the required policy response from a technical vantage point is to offer employment, not to create unemployment and then leave labor idle, but to actually offer employment for those who cannot find it. And then you branch out to all of this other rich literature that has very well demonstrated the link between unemployment and inequality. We can't really claim to solve the various aspects of economic deprivations or address the issue of inequality if we haven't secured the floor. So, I talked a little bit about the social determinants of health, the deaths of despair. Unemployment is kind of a very powerful structural force that really shapes labor markets. It shapes who gets the job, who gets the callback, shapes discrimination, the ability to harass somebody because they don't have an out, wage theft. I mean, you name it. So this rise of the precariat, we sit and bemoan it, but there is a clear solution providing decent, guaranteed employment for all. So the public sector is responsible in part for the problem and for the solution. So the structural features of the job guarantee, what are those structural features? It doesn't rely on fine-tuning or running the economy hot. You may have heard before inflation, the last couple of years, you may have heard pundits say, this is what we want. We want hot economy, more tighter. They bring tighter labor markets. People start to come into the labor market. Wages maybe are increasing for some people, that haven't seen wage increases. So the typical expectation is you just prime the pump, stimulate, and maybe that will produce some sort of desirable results in the labor market. This is not how we're doing things. We're doing it directly. We're providing direct, targeted employment at a base wage. The job guarantee is also not kind of a punitive program where, you are asked to give up your benefits in order to work. It's truly democratizing the terms on which the offer of employment is made. It is voluntary with guaranteed access. So that's what job guarantee means. You have guaranteed access. You will not be turned away. You go to the unemployment office, you submit an application, and you can walk out with a job. It is a bottom-up approach because by its self-selection design, by its targeted employment approach at a basic living wage, it tends to support those who do not have the kind of labor market opportunities that others would have. So you will typically talk about folks at the bottom of the income distribution that are constantly coming and going out of jobs, or experience long-term unemployment. So it is a bottom-up approach. The focus here is that we are closing the labor demand gap. Typically, economists are going to be talking about closing the output gap. So, GDP is going on a particular path. We know we have some sort of shock, and then we want to close that output gap and bring growth back to its path. But we know that for the last half century, we have, we come back, we're recovering from a recession, but labor markets take longer and longer and longer. So jobs don't return. Growth does not generate enough jobs, and much less jobs for all. And we're talking about closing the labor demand gap. So many people wish to work. We are providing the missing employment opportunities. We don't have any more reliance on NAIRU because the direct approach is, in fact, a counter-cyclical approach. Now, What that means, of course, is that whenever there are crises, downturns, as I said, jobs may be the reliable casualty, but now we have an employment safety net. Folks are able to replace a job with a job. There will be some sort of cyclical behavior because of the way the heartbeat of the market economy is. That economic activity tends to accelerate, it tends to slow down. And so the public sector is countercyclical by virtue of its design. And so the job guarantee will have countercyclical features as it responds to layoffs in the private sector. It's a structural feature because it provides a price anchor and a benchmark for all wages in the economy. That employer that is paying $7.25 will have a hard time retaining their workers if the job guarantee pays 15. And so it does provide that kind of floor for the economy-wide wages. It's also a self-limiting program. This is not endless spending. When people don't show up at the door, we stop spending on the program. When they move and find other employment opportunities, the program shrinks. And it is a genuine minimum wage policy for reasons I just described. Now, let me pause a little bit and talk about the anti-cyclical nature of the job guarantee. One of the criticisms that I hear is, well, can really the government do this? Employ a lot of people, disemploy a lot of people. They're coming, they're going. First, I'm going to say, why is the private sector able to do this? Right? Why shouldn't the government be able, they call, mass layoffs, mass hiring, right? That's okay, but the public sector somehow cannot. Well, the most important part is that an economy that operates at full employment is a fundamentally different economy than an economy that operates with mass unemployment. It is more stable economy. You don't see these wild swings in unemployment. If you notice, unemployment has these huge swings. In downturns, it's almost like an avalanche effect. And then slowly the jobs recover and keeps going. And we are still looking at the narrow definition of unemployment, the people who are sloshing in and out of the labor force. And then there are a whole bunch of people who are just out of the labor force. They will take a job if one were available, but we don't see them, right? And so we've got this kind of instability in demand. I use this example, Home Depot, big employers, Walmart, big employers. When there's a downturn and they lay off hundreds of people or thousands of people, what happens to the restaurant, the local restaurant? They lay off some of the waiting staff, right? The taco truck goes out of business. It kind of actually multiplies through the economy. And you also don't know when you're going to get your job back. And so the economy doesn't recover so quickly. But if you know that you have access to decent, stable employment, you continue to patronize the restaurant, the grocer, etc. So we don't have these wild swings in demand just by virtue of that economic security that the employment program provides. So we don't have this yo-yo effect. The economy is far more stable. The reason why the program is anti-cyclical is because of the way the private sector behaves. That is the reason. We created the welfare state in the 30s for reasons of providing economic security. And we transformed the economy. We banished depressions. We banished these huge negative episodes, prolonged negative growth episodes. We ended up with a far more stable economy. It's still a cyclical, but we don't have depressions every 10, 20 years anymore, interspersed with little recessions. We don't have huge booms and busts. We've stabilized the floor, and that is the function of the public sector, of fiscal policy, to be countercyclical. So whatever you may hear about the business cycle, it's there, it's alive. The government sector mitigates it. And so every program has a cyclical component. Even if you look at Social Security, which is like a retirement program, that has a cyclical component. People take up more Social Security in downturns. Medicare, Medicaid, they have cyclical components. So there shouldn't shouldn't be a surprise that the job guarantee too will have some cyclicality to it. Okay. The more stable the labor market, the more stable the economy, the smaller the fluctuations for mass layoffs. If you look at the immediate post-war period, countries that have maintained low, stable unemployment, tight full employment for the long run, Scandinavian countries, even European countries used to have like 2-3% unemployment. Today they're, 8, 10, right? But if you look at those countries, you notice that they're far more stable. Okay. Labor flows are ubiquitous. People come and go out of jobs all the time, right? And maybe that's a good thing if you have a chock full employment, as Vickery would say, right? Then you don't move in between jobs for reasons of distress and economic insecurity, but because there are opportunities out there. And that's kind of the kind of environment we want to create. The second structural feature, well, let me just, it's not a second, but these are the price stabilization features of the job guarantee. I want to just run through those, how the structural approach actually gives us more price stability. So we do have a currency anchor. We know what the price of money is in terms of commodities. And in terms of labor, the most valuable commodity, right? We are setting the price of the currency in terms of public service work performed. By anchoring wages at a living wage level, we have secured the floor. And we also have the counter-cyclical mechanism, which I just explained. The public program, the job guarantee's contribution to the economy diminishes when the economy is growing. So it has a disinflationary effect in an inflationary environment. The program would expand when we have downturns. And so it has inflationary effect in the deflationary environment. Spending on the employment is always at the right level. I think this is really an important point. How much should we spend today to employ every person who wants a job? Imagine we didn't have the inflation boogeyman, right? Like how much more? We spend 26% of GDP in the last year. Should we spend 50% of GDP? 75%? Like how much is enough? Right? There isn't really a ceiling to, even if we had kind of a benevolent, right, government that wanted to do this, we just don't know the limit. And there are good reasons why there's no limit, because the private sector is not in the business of employing everybody. It's not their mission. And so Keynes was so clear about this in chapter 20 of the General Theory. He said, the closer you get to full employment, the more difficult it is to do it. You keep pumping demand, it's going to go to prices. So the capital share of income, not to labor. So actually, he preempts this whole kind of Nairo discussion. He says you can't get to full employment by generalized demand. You have to go directly. You have to target employment to distressed areas. Okay, so the job guarantee is actually that kind of re-articulation of this issue, that the priming the pump model is not going to get you full employment. And so we don't rely on the general stimulative aggregate demand policies. And thus, we don't do this bidding up of prices where already resources are utilized, where, bidding up of workers and of wages to pull into new sources of demand. The job guarantee increases both demand at the bottom, new purchasing power, and supply, public goods and services. We are absorbing part of the wage through the new public service. It's a targeted job creation in the most distressed areas. I often do this talk by showing a map of unemployment across the United States. And some of you might be surprised that there are many communities in this country that have 40, 50% unemployment, right? Involuntary unemployment. I mean, it's just perennial. And so the aggregate statistics don't show this spatial effect, and how really unemployment spreads it has this contagion effect whenever there are mass layoffs in like the epicenter in one urban center and just all the layoffs, then they spread through a community. So we are targeting it. We're just going to the heart of the problem, creating the jobs where they're needed, where we have the most capacity. And so that's also an anti-inflationary kind of approach. We also target projects in areas of social need. So if cost of food is something that is eating away at our paycheck, sustainable agriculture. Instead of traveling to the grocer, there are food deserts across the country in the United States, wealthy nation, but that's typical for Europe and, of course, many, many developing countries. We have food deserts here. Instead of traveling and not even getting access to healthy food, the gas station is the only source of food. Let's do sustainable agriculture. And so in a way, we are providing what is needed and reducing some of those costs. We are reducing existing social and financial costs of unemployment. I mean, that's another important point, that a lot of our expenditure is to deal with unemployment, but also the mass neglect of our capacity. Right? So it's on both sides, on the demand side and on the supply side, we're just not doing it right. And we want to support capacity and we want to provide for economic security. So it is a method for building capacity that alleviates inflationary pressures across sectors. I remember during the pandemic, when schools were reopening, they had trouble finding bus drivers. Right? So pay a good wage, right? Give benefits. You will find them. So this approach also complements Keynes's approach to the broader socialization of investment, which is slightly different thing from the job guarantee. Right? This is where just public investment, good amount of investment in the economy is under public guidance, but that does provide more stability to the economy as a whole, so that the job guarantee is that much smaller. So I'm about to close out, but how do you go about doing this? The very obvious one is the Green New Deal. I mean, it is an all hands on deck approach. There is no shortage of work to be done. And I often say that there may not be enough people to do all the work that we need to do, but we have quite a lot to address our most urgent challenges. And so the job guarantee was called the most crucial component of the Green New Deal. And what is really important in the current climate discourse is that virtually every statement, and not just the Paris Accord, links the just transition to just transition of workers. That in some sense, it saving the environment while people experience the devastation from economic insecurity is not solving the job. And then providing you a good job, guaranteeing you with a good job while you're still drinking polluted water is also not doing the job. Like, these things are organically connected. And perhaps more, concerning is the latest UN report of 2022 that is talking about global collapse. They're running like 5 scenarios, possible scenarios. And out of the 5 scenarios, they are finding a very serious threat of civilizational collapse, that the environmental systems are so destabilized that they create social system instability, poverty, miseration, and all of that, social antagonism. And then that in and of itself prevents us from actually mobilizing policy action. We become more polarized and prevents us from actually focusing on the correct policy tools, which then feeds into the environmental instability. So it is this kind of feedback effect and those tipping points. But of course, there are so many things to do beyond just the climate as well. The experience with job guarantee-like programs, and I think we'll have a chance to talk about those, it is usually focused on a comprehensive set of public service that we can broadly call care. It's the care economy. And it does deal with both food security and social care, but it also deals with arts and culture, with education, with environmental services. So this is a map of the kind of work that can be done. I'm going to conclude by saying that the job guarantee is popular. This is a survey that was done in 2019 by the Harris Hill polling agency, and you break it down by by different demographic group, and you find overwhelming support for the job guarantee. We've done this in France. The UK had a survey on the job guarantee. There have been other surveys since the 60s that show strong support for the public sector to create employment for the unemployed. And the Gallup poll last year, 2021, found that 93% of the polled public supported government employment program as a response to the crisis. But I want to say the job guarantee is not a policy for just the moment of crisis. It really is that structural support that I had articulated. So there are 3 paths to the job guarantee. It is the first and most important is the human rights case that connects our civil and economic rights. And we need to start from that moral proposition first and foremost. The climate case is undeniable. We need all hands on deck, but we can't go there. We can't make good on these promises without understanding the economic tools before us. And I think that's what the MMT project contributes. Thank you.
So what follows is the question and answer section of the presentation, and the questions didn't record very clearly, so I'm going to dive in here and interpret them to the best of my abilities. Apologies in advance if I've made any mistakes, but the first one is, given that mass exploitation is required by those who are on top in our economic system, how do you get the job guarantee to pass in a world where this is the case?
So, I've learned that this doesn't convince many people. You guys are here to learn the MMT approach. And so we need to understand the principal tools before us. But it does convince some people, like people in finance. I've given this talk to central bankers. They actually see the anti-inflationary effect. That's appealing to them. But I think the primary problem is that the idea has not been there for such a long time. When you consider the New Deal, like the CWA was considered, Civil Works Administration was considered to be, was the most popular program. And people so liked it that they started to think of it as a right. So once you do these programs, they're very popular, and it would be good to do them on the grounds of legally enforceable rights so that they're not taken away. The reason why we lost the New Deal program is because a conservative budget director convinced FDR not to reauthorize it. So you see, the deficit myth, once again, kind of, acted as a very important tool. The one program that I think needs more attention is India's program. Everybody says, oh, you don't have institutional capacity to do this. This is so hard to do. Oh, India has rural guarantee. It's not universal. It doesn't pay, full living wage jobs, but it provides 100 days of guaranteed employment to a rural family. And on a given day, it benefits 26 to 30% of rural households. In the pandemic, it was upwards of 40%. And so it has been crucial, and it's a program you can't take away. It has its problems. I'm happy to talk about it, but it has been truly a different path to economic stabilization and security, like economic security policy, that has been very helpful as a primary program that deals with water insecurity, with some environmental issues in rural communities. So I think it is really underappreciated. At the same time, people are now starting to recognize that they want more of this. They want not 100 days, they want 200 days. They want urban employment. So I really don't find these to be unsurmountable. I take seriously the political economy, the critique, political economy of full employment. But I don't think that they are unsurmountable. I think it's the way we go about doing them. I've shared this experience in the past, how this happened. The Plan Jefes was implemented in Argentina. And, it was somebody sitting in the audience as we were presenting the employer of last resort. And the economists took the program and, proposed it to the Ministry of Labor and tried it year after year. And 4 years, no takers. And then the crisis came upon Argentina and they pulled it off the shelf and they implemented it as people took to the streets asking for jobs. If they had done it as a permanent policy, I think we would have had, a lot more success. It was kind of phased out. But I think there are opportunities. And the first step is to make the idea, to mainstream the idea. We are writing proposals for a European job guarantee for just many different corners in the world. So I think the first step is really mainstreaming the idea. And second, looking to real life experiences. I think Rania is going to talk about what she did in Greece. We have small programs in Europe. We have big programs. They have real material effects. And I think they're not in the people's consciousness.
This next question is, with regard to development economics, can you talk about the job guarantee in the context of countries that face some constraints? Maybe they have an IMF loan or other external debt. Is the job guarantee something that they'd have to work up to being able to afford, or would they need to have monetary sovereignty before they could implement one?
That's a really good question. I don't think monetary sovereignty is a precondition. One of the reasons why is we know that, like France is doing it. It's not the kind of structural policy that I'm articulating here with its kind of anti-cyclical stabilization effects. But, France has the 0 long-term unemployment areas. They had launched this pilot, I forget how many years ago, in just 10 municipalities. They tried hard really to convince the mayors to take it up. And all of a sudden it became popular. So popular that they started calling them to ask for the program. And now it was reauthorized in this last parliamentary session, I think, or the one last year, 2 more areas. What do? It's voluntary. So people who are trapped in long-term unemployment are provided an employment opportunity. They have to opt into it. And they have found that actually the costs of unemployment are so high for communities that this makes even financial sense. Okay. So I don't think these are these neglected costs that we talk about. So I think that it's not necessarily a prerequisite because the unemployed are already the charge of the public sector. Now, we've talked with, Ndongo and Fidel very often about how, this is a really key tool for food sovereignty. That's one of the key conditions for limiting your policy space, but you could do sustainable agriculture. You could do, local schools. You could do, employ your domestic resources because they're employed in the domestic currency. It has no bearing in a sense on your ability to pay the debt because you're generating you're using your local resources, generating local benefits. So I think it is a tool for the taking. But if you have major crises, I would say for the developed world, for example, where you would need to, on short order, mobilize large financial resources, that monetary sovereignty helps. But what did the COVID crisis teach us? That even non-monetary sovereign areas discover their sovereignty to deal with their crises.
The next question is, what happens if there's a job that started as part of the job guarantee that turns out to be so important it gets moved into the main government budget?
Yes. So quite often we clarify that these are not jobs that will staff all the civil servant offices and public, sector offices and kind of mainline employment jobs. So this is a additional program for the unemployed, and kind of the environmental angle helps here. How do I, as a practical matter, if there are food deserts in the United States and we launch a job guarantee with sustainable agriculture, and then it turns out that this becomes kind of a strategic investment for those communities, I would very much hope that remains a permanent infrastructure, remains part of the kind of funding model, right? It's appropriated budget for these. But those sites will be the places where a person who loses a job can come to and find employment. So I think that the job guarantee can provide us with infrastructure of employment in the care sector, right? Those are underfunded, right? Underprovided, after school activities. So we can think about what those would be. So the projects will be permanent, but the staffing can certainly come and go.
The next question is, if the job guarantee provided training, wouldn't that present a project management problem? Let's say I'm in the program and I do 4 months of training and suddenly I find a job and I leave the program, which works for me, but it's disruptive to the project. So does that mean the job guarantee necessarily can only be used to employ unskilled labor?
So I'm going to challenge a lot of the frames. It is true that it will be for folks who are at the bottom of the income distribution. People who have experience that is rather unstable, like that's the coming and going. And I would challenge the notion is because they're quote unproductive. It's just the private sector works in such way that it just disposes of certain people that it considers not productive. So it is targeted at the bottom of the income distribution. Precarious income, precarious employment conditions. I challenge the notion of unproductive because what is unproductive? If you plant a tree or you clean up like a lake, private sector would call it not productive, right, in a certain sense. But for us, it is incredibly socially useful. Like sanitation is like so critical, right? And you often see people as kind of easily replaceable. Right. And that's based on this notion of what, productive is. So it is a different perspective on how we see people's contribution. The zero long-term unemployment areas, they begin, no one is unemployable. Everybody has something to contribute to the public project. So it is true it will be targeted at the bottom of the income distribution, but we very much believe that this is socially productive. If they go, will it be disruptive to the project? So very legitimate question. My sense is that if you look at these projects like the rural employment program, large scale, that there is always a permanent kind of work being done on these wells or water systems. And for us, my example that I gave was sustainable agriculture or care. So my sense would be that actually we will have that permanent infrastructure, but people come and go in the public schools all the time, right? You go and you get your training for the 6 months and then you go on to the next job. So I don't see that that's what I was trying to explain with the cyclical aspect, that this is not this enormous in and out that is happening, that actually we're just stabilizing the economy, stabilizing social provisioning, and some people are going to lose their jobs and they'll find themselves not knowing what to do. And then there will be a care center, communities, CSA locally that they can go to. We've seen this, Kansas City has it really great. The Farmers Guys, they do great things for at-risk youth, for women, caregivers, like they're there always. And people can come and leave as needed.
So at this point, a number of questions were collected, and just paraphrasing, they were, if the job guarantee lifts the minimum wage, some firms will see their profits go down. So what might the redistributive effects of that be? How do we make sure the job guarantee doesn't give a handout to the corporate sector? Would you favour an incremental approach to implementing the job guarantee? What are the implications for domestic and informal labour? And this first question, as far as I can make out, is, can you talk about how the job guarantee competes with the private sector? Will it bid up wages?
I think this is really a question of the vision of the economy. Like, what is a good economy? I don't think the job guarantee is going to give it to us. The vision of a good economy is a much broader vision. It means, how do we provide public goods? And the job guarantee helps with that mission, right? But a robust public sector is critical. And so we often say, why are our schools understaffed and, underfunded? Like, get the teachers. This should not be a job guarantee job, right? Like, staff the NHS, the healthcare system in the United States, community health clinics. I mean, the healthcare system in this country is abysmal, and we have like health deserts and people don't have access. A community health center would be fantastic. So I think that, when we think of the public purse, we're really re-envisioning the public purpose. Not re-envisioning, we are trying to kind of make good on some promises, right, of the public purpose. And then the job guarantee, it becomes the genuine employment safety net. So if the schools are properly staffed and you have a young person graduating in a recession and they want to get some training, like on the job training, and shadow a teacher, then they can do that with the job guarantee, right? If there is plenty of environmental projects in the Hudson Valley, and there's an employment opportunity there, somebody who wants to, move into green investment or some career, right? You can start there. So we do have the concrete mechanism to kind of bring people who find themselves without work. So public sector, you could envision as a bigger program, a permanent infrastructure with a smaller job guarantee. In my ideal world, we will not have 20 million people in the job guarantee in the US. The economy shouldn't be working this way, to be disposing of 20 million people on regular basis, right? It should have stable overall employment. And I think this is kind of the supportive foundation that will ensure that these other jobs are also more stable. And so the bidding up of wages, again, if it's a small program, certainly it will not be bidding up of wages if you're not trying to do the kinds of things that the mainline jobs are trying to do. I think the bidding up of wages is what currently happens. You give somebody a stimulus, you give them a contract, the construction company comes in, they're already short-staffed, they're trying to get folks from the other construction companies. You got some environmental group that is doing radiant heat. They don't have enough people. They're like, we got contracts. Let's get the workers from the other place bidding up the wages. So the bidding up the wages is happening now. And it's always for people who have jobs and have good, stable jobs. The job guarantee provides employment where it's missing. And so it's actually raising the floor. And in that sense, I drew the distinction of how we do things. If it is a strategic goal that the public sector does mass environmental solar panel installation and we need more skilled people, then you got to do credentialing, training. I go back to that there's no unskilled person. You just grab a person and give them the training. And we've done this many, many other times. So a little bit of planning, it will definitely, a little bit, planning and experimentation, as Keynes says. How do we make sure the money doesn't go to the corporate sector? The first way is that we don't subsidize the jobs in the corporate sector. It's a job guarantee, public money for public purpose, for the kinds of things the corporate sector is not doing today. In that sense, it doesn't go directly to the corporate sector. I mean, if you take the macro view, of course, right, we know like the sources of profit, and it's all distributive. It depends, the monopoly power that Fadel was talking about, like who's able to raise your rent, who's able to, charge you high health insurance. The job guarantee is not going to solve that problem, but it will make sure you're not going to die on the street. Incremental or a big, bold approach? I'll take anything. We just got to start somewhere. It's interesting. Moments of crisis sometimes present an important opportunity to put in place policies. If we have MMT-informed design where we make sure that they become part of the permanent policy infrastructure, I think it's very important because we are trapped in this crisis response mode. That's how fiscal policy works. We face a crisis, then we try to respond to it. And this stop-go approach doesn't seem to work. The idea of automatic stabilizers is being kind of revived a little bit. So we need to be thinking about preventative measures. So that should be part of our design, permanent and preventative. Potentially the French model could work where there is sufficient demand from the ground up where the federal government has to pay attention. Or they could be the backroom kind of conversation and maneuvering that took place in India to convince the government and find an ally to put in place a legally enforceable right to employment. domestic labor and informal labor, very important. This is a care program that can help unpaid work, and it can help it by socializing some of that work. But it's not a program that demands for everybody to be engaged in paid employment. So it's again a question of what's the good economy. Like, how do we structure it so that we alleviate, the many hours that women spend bringing water in developing countries, right, to the home, like build the infrastructure, socialize some of that work, provide childcare so that the unpaid work in the home becomes less onerous. But the job guarantee is situated within a broader understanding of what the welfare safety net is. It's not the end of public policy. It is part and parcel of income support programs, child allowances, retirement security, the complex set of welfare policies that we have to address various dimensions of economic insecurity. So you can certainly think of like a domestic kind of income for a domestic labor. But we've talked about this a lot with Ndongo, that the informal sector is very large, and the job guarantee can be an effective way of formalizing some of these informal labor relationships.
And this last question is, what should the job guarantee wage level be? The current minimum wage or higher?
What should be the wage level? Yes. There are several ways of thinking about the wage level. Typically in these public employment programs, and kind of practical experience, we have had two models. One is the less disruptive model, meaning that it's below the minimum wage. And that's effectively what happened in Argentina. The wage was set at what at the time was minimum wage, but then the minimum wage was raised and the jefes wage wasn't raised. So that's the punitive model. Like, it's really not real work. It's not real employment. You're not really employable. You got to demonstrate that you're good for it. So you got to, somebody can hire you. The private sector will still hire you, and it's cheaper for them to do it. The other one is more just like the minimum wage. There are models where they say, okay, this is what we believe should be the labor standard. You meet the minimum wage standard. So that's how it is set. And then the third model is the slightly disruptive wage, which is the one we prefer, which is the living wage. Our minimum wage is inadequate. 7.25 hasn't been changed since 2009. There are living wage ordinances, in cities, states, because they recognize you can't pay rent on $7, right? So that is happening. And we think it cannot happen without a job guarantee at a level that robust, to secure the robust floor. So we prefer that we have a political process that articulates what is the basic living wage, that statutory, it is required that it is revised in the job guarantee as cost of living increase. And there's some discussion about whether you index it or not. But, if you want 2% inflation, you can kind of index it 2% and increase it that way.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month, and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino, and you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.